Lee Kuan Yew never believed that modern conflicts end the way they begin. They may start with ideology, emotion, or provocation, but they end through exhaustion, adjustment, and the quiet recognition of limits. If asked to predict how the Iran conflict will ultimately end, he would not speak in terms of victory or defeat. He would speak in terms of equilibrium, not a moral resolution, not a decisive triumph, but a new balance shaped by constraint rather than ambition. In Lee's thinking, wars and prolonged confrontations in the modern era are no longer contests of total domination. They are contests of endurance, legitimacy, and internal cohesion. The decisive factor is rarely battlefield success alone. It is whether a state can sustain pressure without hollowing itself out. From that perspective, the Iran conflict is not primarily about missiles, proxies, or even nuclear capability. It is about how long each actor can tolerate instability before recalibrating its objectives. Lee would begin by separating rhetoric from structure. Rhetoric suggests inevitability of escalation. Structure suggests the opposite. Iran operates within severe economic, demographic, and institutional constraints. Its leadership may project ideological resolve, but the state itself must manage inflation, unemployment, public dissatisfaction, and elite cohesion. No ideology survives prolonged material failure without adaptation. Lee believed this was a universal rule. He would also reject the idea that the conflict will end through regime collapse or total capitulation. Such outcomes are rare, unpredictable, and usually produce chaos rather than stability. Instead, he would predict that the conflict will taper into a constrained equilibrium where Iran remains intact, but bounded, pressured but not destroyed, contained but not eliminated. From Lee's perspective, the critical variable is not external pressure alone, but internal tolerance for cost. Iran's leadership can withstand sanctions, isolation, and limited confrontation for a time. But over time, those pressures force prioritization. External confrontation competes with internal survival. When the two collide, internal survival always wins. He would also emphasize that Iran's adversaries face limits of their own. Sustained confrontation drains resources, attention, and political capital. Great powers rarely maintain focus on a single regional conflict indefinitely, especially when competing priorities emerge elsewhere. Over time, pressure to stabilize rather than escalate grows on all sides. Lee believed that conflicts end when all parties privately accept that their maximum objectives are unattainable. Publicly, they continue to posture. Privately, they adjust. This adjustment does not require trust or reconciliation. It requires recognition of reality. In the case of Iran, that reality includes geography, population, national identity, and regional influence that cannot be erased through force without catastrophic consequences. Attempts to eliminate Iran as a strategic actor would destabilize the entire region and impose costs no external power is willing to bear indefinitely. Lee would see this as a structural constraint that makes total victory impossible. He would predict that the conflict will therefore move toward implicit rules, not written agreements, but understood boundaries, limits on escalation, tolerated behaviors, red lines that are tested but rarely crossed fully. This is not peace, it is managed hostility. History is full of such arrangements, even if they are never formally acknowledged. Lee would likely compare this trajectory to other prolonged confrontations that ended not with treaties, but with fatigue and recalibration. Over time, intensity declines. Proxy conflicts cool. Diplomatic channels reopen quietly. Sanctions are adjusted rather than lifted entirely. Military signaling continues, but actual confrontation becomes rarer. He would also stress that Iran's behavior will evolve, not disappear. The state will seek influence through less costly means as pressure increases. Ideology gives way to pragmatism when survival is at stake. This shift does not require ideological conversion. It requires administrative necessity. Lee believed that states ultimately behave rationally when confronted with long-term cost curves they cannot escape. Iran is no exception. The leadership may speak in absolutist terms, but governance forces compromise. The more prolonged the pressure, the more selective Iran's external engagements will become. At the same time, Lee would caution against expecting a clean resolution. The conflict will not end with a declaration. It will fade into a new normal. Tensions will persist, distrust will remain, but escalation will become less frequent because it becomes too costly relative to achievable gains. He would also note that regional actors have strong incentives to stabilize. Prolonged instability threatens trade, energy markets, and domestic legitimacy across the region. These pressures create informal coalitions in favor of de-escalation, even among rivals who publicly deny cooperation. In Lee's framework, the end state is not harmony, but containment through mutual restraint. Iran will remain a difficult actor, but a constrained one. Its adversaries will remain vigilant, but less inclined to pursue maximalist outcomes. The conflict will settle into a low-grade standoff managed through deterrence, diplomacy, and tacit understanding. Lee would emphasize that this outcome is not a failure of strategy, but a success of realism. Absolute outcomes are rare in complex systems. Sustainable outcomes are modest by design. They prioritize stability over satisfaction. He would also warn that impatience is the greatest risk. Attempts to force a decisive ending often prolong conflict by hardening resistance and escalating costs. Time, in his view, is a strategic asset when used to allow pressure to reshape incentives rather than provoke collapse. Ultimately, Kuan would predict that the Iran conflict ends not when one side wins, but when all sides quietly adjust their expectations. When maximal goals are abandoned in favor of survivable ones. When confrontation gives way to management. The final outcome will not feel like resolution. It will feel anticlimactic. And that, Lee would say, is how most serious conflicts end in the modern world. Not with victory parades, but with a reluctant acceptance of limits. That acceptance, rather than force, is what will finally bring the conflict to its end. Kuan would continue his prediction by emphasizing that the most revealing phase of the Iran conflict will not be marked by escalation, but by normalization. Not normalization in the sense of friendship or reconciliation, but normalization of restraint. When a conflict becomes routine rather than urgent, when it is managed rather than dramatized, it is already approaching its end state. He would argue that the modern international system no longer rewards total victories. It punishes them. The destruction of a state creates vacuums that draw in far more instability than the original problem ever generated. From this perspective, any strategy aimed at fully dismantling Iran's political system would be self-defeating. The costs would ripple outward, destabilizing neighbors, disrupting energy flows, and forcing prolonged external involvement. No major power, Lee would say, is willing to pay that price indefinitely. Instead, he would predict a gradual convergence toward tacit limits. Iran will continue to test boundaries, but with increasing caution. Its leadership understands that miscalculation could trigger consequences it cannot control. Over time, the tests become more symbolic than substantive. Rhetoric remains fierce, but actions are calibrated. This pattern is not unique to Iran. It is the natural behavior of states under sustained pressure that seek survival rather than domination. Lee would also note that internal dynamics are decisive. Iran's population is young, urbanizing, and increasingly focused on economic opportunity rather than ideological confrontation. While the state can suppress dissent, it cannot ignore demographic reality forever. Economic pressure reshapes political priorities slowly but relentlessly. External confrontation becomes harder to justify when internal demands intensify. He would caution against interpreting this shift as weakness. It is adaptation. States that survive learn when to harden and when to bend. Iran's system, for all its rigidity, is not irrational. It will seek arrangements that reduce pressure without appearing to surrender. That is why the end of the conflict will likely involve ambiguous outcomes, partial concessions, reversible steps, and deniable understandings. Lee would stress that ambiguity is not a flaw, it is a feature. Ambiguity allows leaders to sell compromise domestically without admitting defeat. It preserves face. It lowers the political cost of restraint. Many durable geopolitical arrangements rely on ambiguity precisely because clarity can be destabilizing. He would also broaden the lens to include external actors. The United States and its partners face their own constraints, shifting public opinion, competing global priorities, and finite resources. Sustained confrontation with Iran competes with other strategic imperatives. Over time, attention diffuses. Pressure becomes more selective. Enforcement becomes more targeted. This diffusion does not signal abandonment. It signals reprioritization. Lee believed that conflicts often end when attention wanes, not because the issues disappear, but because the system can no longer sustain high-intensity focus. Iran will remain a concern, but not the defining one. When that happens, incentives change. Actors seek stability to free up capacity elsewhere. He would also point out that regional actors play a quiet but decisive role. Neighboring states have little interest in perpetual escalation. They bear the immediate costs of instability, economic disruption, security risks, and domestic anxiety. Over time, these states push for de-escalation through back channels, economic engagement, and confidence-building measures that never make headlines. Lee would predict that the final shape of the conflict will resemble a managed standoff rather than a settlement. Iran will retain influence, but within understood bounds. Its adversaries will maintain deterrence, but avoid provocation. Occasional crises will flare, but they will be contained more quickly than before. This is not peace, it is equilibrium. He would remind listeners that equilibrium is not static. It requires constant adjustment. The end of the Iran conflict, in his view, is not an event, but a process. It unfolds unevenly. It advances through setbacks. It is sustained by the shared recognition that escalation offers diminishing returns. Lee would also warn against triumphalism. Declaring victory too early invites backlash. It hardens positions. It undermines the very restraint that makes equilibrium possible. The most successful outcomes are those that feel unsatisfying to everyone but acceptable to all. In his final assessment, Kuan would say that the Iran conflict will end, not because ideology is defeated, but because reality asserts itself. States cannot escape their constraints forever. Geography, demography, economics, and institutional capacity impose limits that no rhetoric can override indefinitely. The conflict's end will be quiet. There will be no signing ceremony that resolves everything. There will be no moment of closure that satisfies observers. Instead, there will be fewer crises, longer pauses, and more routine diplomacy. The conflict will fade into the background of global affairs, still present but no longer consuming. And Lee would conclude with a broader lesson. The measure of strategic wisdom is not how forcefully a conflict is pursued, but how intelligently it is concluded. In the modern world, endings are rarely clean. They are negotiated by time, cost, and constraint. That is how the Iran conflict will ultimately end, not with a decisive blow, but with a gradual, reluctant acceptance of limits by all involved. That acceptance, rather than force, is what will finally bring the conflict to its end.